good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are joining us from. I'm glad and delighted that you have managed to make time for us to be here in this AMR CoP session on the 18th of October, and we're excited and looking forward to a very informative session. My name is Patience Dabula. I'm employed in the ASLM as a project manager responsible for EQA Africa, among other things. Please note that there's simultaneous interpretation from English to French. We also have one from English to Portuguese. So that you can access, if you look at the bottom of your screen, you should be able to see an icon like a globe that will then be able to allow you to choose the language of preference. And we do have people that are going to be taking us through the session in different sessions. And that will also help you to be able to be comfortable to listen to the session in a language that you prefer. Determination of bacterial resistance to antimicrobial is an important part in management of infections. And this has been like this for many years. We all know from many, many days ago, disk diffusion was the only method that was available to check and decide whether organisms are resistant or they are sensitive to different antibiotics. Over the years, this has been supplemented or augmented for some organisms by automated systems. However, the importance of having antimicrobial resistance disk method testing has not gone away, because most of the organisms, you still go back to what I call the gold standard. And at the same time, everybody keeps on continuing to look for what is ideal, even when the automated systems are not available or we are unable then to get to the solutions. As a result, the importance of laboratories having all those skills that are needed for correct disk diffusion testing are always important, and that does not go away. These are skills that we need then to always harness and improve, because when you look at performance by laboratories, looking at the results coming from various EQA programs or proficiency testing scheme, we can clearly admit that there's room for improvement. And as a result, ASLM has taken it upon itself to continue looking for speakers and hosting webinars like this that are then going to improve our skills. And the sessions are available today and continually thereafter, where you can go back and listen to them again in order to improve that. Today's presentation follows previous ones where we looked at mechanisms of resistance, concentrating on testing in laboratory. And last week we covered the EUCAST system and EUCAST clinical breakpoints by Prof. Guna. And I'm glad today and honored to introduce Dr. Erika, who is going to take us through today's session. And we are looking at EUCAST Disk Diffusion Antimicrobial Susceptibility Testing. This session will be 1 hour long and include a question and answer session at the end. So we're encouraging you that throughout the presentation, please type your questions, please type your comments, and also areas that you think will be beneficial for all of us, so that we can then be able to address them towards the end, and we hope to cover as much as possible thereafter. Going back to Dr. Erika Matuschek. Dr. Erika is a head of EUCAST Development Laboratory, known as EDL, in Vaxholm, Sweden. She has a PhD in bioscience, Chalmers School of Technology, Göteborg. I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, Sweden. Erika is an expert in phenotypic antimicrobial resistant testing and responsible for the development and maintenance of EUCAST methods, publication of EUCAST methodology, documents, quality control tables, and breakpoint tables. She's a member of EUCAST Steering Committee, the CLSI Quality Control Working Group, and a standard developer at SIS, including being an active member of the project group for revision of the ISO standard 20776, one reference methodology for broth dilution. Dr. Erika, over to you. We're looking forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thanks for that nice introduction. As Patience already said, this presentation will be on the EUCAST Disk Diffusion Method and also how it is calibrated to reference MICs. Here you can see on the map where we are located, the EUCAST Development Laboratory, EDL, in the southern parts of Sweden. Our main task is to develop and maintain EUCAST methods. We are responsible for developing zone diameter breakpoints and disk diffusion criteria, but we also develop reference MIC methods for organisms which previously was not included in the reference method. We work as the support unit to all clinical laboratories using EUCAST methods, and we help troubleshoot when you have problems. We are a lot involved in different educational activities like this one, and also international conferences and courses. To some extent, we also look into AST materials available on the market, for example, discs or media from different manufacturers, but that is something that we do quite a small part of our time. Many things that we do, we like to test in other laboratories. So we have a network of laboratories which also help us a lot in our developmental work. But back to antimicrobial susceptibility testing. With any antimicrobial susceptibility testing method, it is crucial to adhere to the methodology, and that is the way to get reproducible and reliable results. This goes, of course, for every method that you use, if it's the reference broth microdilution method, if it's disk diffusion, or if it is a commercial product or method. So in the disk diffusion method, we have standardized the disk potency, the actual amount of antibiotic that you put into the disk, the testing media, both the type of media, but also supplements, pH, and the agar depth. We have standardized the inoculum, the size of the inoculum, incubation, time, atmosphere, and temperature. And the part that is most difficult to standardize is reading of results. But we have tried to explain it in Word and also have pictures with examples in the EUCAST reading guide. So to use EUCAST breakpoints and to interpret your results according to EUCAST breakpoints, you should follow all the instructions in the EUCAST Disk Diffusion Manual to get reliable results. Disk diffusion is based on that the antibiotic diffuses from a paper disc impregnated with an antimicrobial agent to form a concentration gradient in the agar. And I think this picture describes it very nicely. Here we have an agar plate, and we have the inoculum on the top of the agar, on the agar surface, and then we have the antimicrobial disc. And as soon as we put the disc on the agar plate, the antibiotic will start to diffuse. And the concentration of the antibiotic is highest close to the disc, and then it decreases until you reach a certain concentration, which actually is the MIC value, and there you will have inhibition of growth. But to mean anything, the disk diffusion method must be calibrated to MIC values and to MIC breakpoints. Here is a summary table of the medium, inoculum, and incubation recommendations for different organisms. Non-fastidious organisms are tested on unsupplemented millihinton agar, here abbreviated MH, with an inoculum of McFarland 0.5, and the plates are incubated in air at 35 degrees and for 16 to 20 hours. For most fastidious organisms, they will be tested on the MHF agar, that is millihinton agar, with 5% defibrinated horse blood and 20 milligrams per liter beta NAD. The inoculum is the same, incubation time and temperature is the same, but those plates are incubated in 5% carbon dioxide. Campylobacter has its own method. It's still MHF agar and McFarland 0.5, but incubation must be in microaerobic environment at a higher temperature and for longer time. And quite recently, we also published a disk diffusion method for anaerobic bacteria, which previously had been lacking in the EUCAST system. And for this, we have developed another medium. The MHF medium is not good enough for testing anaerobic bacteria. So here we need another medium. And the one that we choose is FAAHB. FAA stands for fastidious anaerobe agar and is the agar base. And then we add defibrinated horse blood. For the anaerobes, we recommend a higher inoculum, McFarland 1, and plates should be incubated in an anaerobic environment at 35 to 37 degrees and for 16 to 20 hours. And this means that some bacteria, and specifically fastidious organisms and anaerobes, will not be able to be tested with the disk diffusion method, but the ones that are listed can be tested and interpreted according to EUCAST breakpoints. If we start to look at the media, there are some important aspects. One is the agar depth. The agar depth should be 4 millimeters plus minus 0.5. And then you see again the same picture as we already looked at, where we have an optimal agar depth and diffusion is going very nicely in 3 dimensions here. But you can also easily see here what happens if the agar is too thin. The antibiotic will continue to diffuse up again to the surface and the zone diameter will be larger. And the opposite is true for if we have a too thick agar depth, then zones will be smaller. So to use EUCAST breakpoints, to use EUCAST QC criteria, you should use plates with an agar depth of 4 millimeters. Another important aspect is that the plates should not be too humid when they are used. The surface of the agar should be dry before you inoculate them. Excess humidity can cause problems with fuzzy zonages and or haze within zones, making it difficult to read zone diameters. This is most often seen on MHF and FAAHB plates. So what you can do is that when you have stored your plates in the fridge, then they should always reach room temperature before you inoculate them. When they have been in room temperature and when they have reached room temperature, you can open the plate and make sure that you do not have any drops of water on the agar surface or inside the lid. If you have that, you should probably dry the plates. It's more common with excess humidity in plates that are packed in plastic bags. And you can dry plates either at 20 to 25 degrees overnight or in the incubator at 35 degrees with the lid removed for 15 minutes. I'm not sure if you can see it well on this picture, but I will explain it to you. This is an Haemophilus influenzae QC strain, which is susceptible to cefotaxime, and cefotaxime is the disc put on this plate. We have used the same inoculum suspension on both plates, treated them exactly the same. The plate to the left is an in-house produced plate. It was only stored in a ventilated rack in the fridge. And then to the right, you have a commercial plate. The commercial plate was allowed, both plates were allowed to reach room temperature, but they were not dried specifically. If we look at the in-house produced plate, we have a large, nice zone with a quite clear zone diameter, and you can easily read that zone diameter. With a commercial plate, you have a very large fuzzy zone here, then there is an empty part, and then you have growth again close to the disc. So if it looks like this, I would say that it is actually not possible to read the zone diameter. We would have to retest and try to find out why. And in this case, we could see that if we dried the plates, though that haziness disappeared and we could read the zone diameter. The inoculum should be prepared from an overnight culture on non-selective media. It is important to pick several morphologically similar colonies to avoid selecting an atypical variant. And when you have picked your colonies, you suspend in saline, mix to an even turbidity, and adjust the density to McFarland 0.5. And the best option is to use a photometric device, a densitometer or something similar, to measure the McFarland value. If that is not possible, there are standards that you can use to visually compare a McFarland 0.5 standard. When plates are inoculated, it is important to spread the inoculum evenly over the entire surface by either swabbing in 3 directions or by using a plate rotator. If you are inoculating several agar plates from the same inoculum suspension, you should dip the cotton swab into the suspension for each agar plate. The inoculum is standardized in the way that it should be McFarland 0.5, which corresponds to a specific amount of bacteria or an approximate amount of bacteria. But we still have to inoculate plates a little bit differently depending on which organisms we test. So in general, we have these recommendations. For gram-negative bacteria, you should remove excess fluid from the cotton swab by pressing and turning the swab against the inside of the tube to avoid over-inoculation. For gram-positive bacteria, we recommend that you do not remove excess fluid and that you also take particular care when you streak the plate to ensure that there are no gaps between streaks, meaning you should take it a little bit slower and maybe streak 1 more layer to get a nice confluent growth. Antimicrobial discs should be stored and handled according to the manufacturer's instructions. It's very important that opened cartridges are stored with a desiccant. With antimicrobial paper discs, the antibiotic content is sensitive to humidity and the air. So if the paper discs get humid, the antibiotic will start to degrade. So that is why we want to store them with a desiccant. And it is also very important if you take antimicrobial discs or cartridges from the fridge or maybe the freezer, that they always reach room temperature before they are opened. And that's the same reason. If the discs are cold and the air is warm, the discs will absorb humidity from the air. When you apply the discs on your agar plate, inoculated agar plate, it is important to limit the number of discs per plate. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One is that if you have a very sensitive organism that will have large zones for many antibiotics, there will not be enough space on the agar surface, or you might not even see that you have a bacteria growing there. But it's also important to avoid interference between agents that we do not want to have on our test. We want to measure each agent individually, and there will also be overlapping of zones if we put too many discs on a plate. So we recommend that you put the number of discs on a plate that will make it possible for you to read whole zone diameters. After application of discs, you should invert the plates and incubate them, and that should be within 15 minutes of disc applications. And we already looked at the different incubation environments. The incubation time is, unless otherwise stated, 16 to 20 hours, and it is important not to prolong the incubation time. For some organisms or species that do not grow very well, we have validated a prolonged incubation time, but that is only done for Corynebacteria, Aerococcus, Kingella kingae, and also for Campylobacter. So for these organisms, when you look at your plate after 16 to 20 hours, or 24 hours for Campylobacter, and you don't have sufficient growth, then you can prolong incubation. For other organisms, we have not validated this, but we know from our studies and experience that the zone sizes might change a lot with prolonged incubation. So that is not recommended unless specifically stated. When you put the plates into the incubator, it's also good not to have too high stacks. The reason for that is that you would like the plates to reach 35 degrees quite simultaneously. And if you have very high stacks, it will take longer for the plates in the middle of the stack. We don't have an absolute number here, but we know that for most incubators, a maximum of 5 plates per stack is appropriate. This is something that we haven't invented ourselves because CLSI has the same recommendation, but we have given it a name, the 15-15-15 minute rule. And that relates to when you, from the time that you start making your inoculum suspension till the time that you put your plate into the incubator. So we say that you should use the inoculum suspension optimally within 15 minutes of preparation and always within 60 minutes. It's always better to use it within 15 minutes. And for anaerobic bacteria, you should always do that. We have allowed up to 60 minutes because we can see that it will not affect many other non-fastidious organisms. And we know that it might fit better into a workflow in some laboratories. But after making, use the inoculum suspension within 15 minutes, meaning you're inoculating your plates. Then after an additional 15 minutes, you should apply the discs, at most 15 minutes in between, and then incubate the plate within 15 minutes of disc application. There is no problem doing this faster than the 15 minutes. That's the maximum numbered between the different steps. The reason for having this recommendation is that the antibiotic will diffuse as soon as the disc is put on the agar surface. The bacteria will start to grow, but many of them will not grow so well at lower temperatures, the room temperature, as in the recommended incubation temperature. And we want that to happen at the same time. We want the antibiotic to diffuse and the bacteria to start to grow at the same time. And we know that delays between those two could result in different zone sizes. Here are some examples on what we want the plates to look like after incubation, and some examples what we would not want them to look like. The examples to the left show plates with a nice, evenly spread confluent growth, and the plates to the right have some different problems. And these correspond to the same isolate. Here is an E. coli, the same one here. Then we have Pseudomonas aeruginosa, Staph aureus, and Haemophilus influenza. And if we look at the not so good side, we can see that for the E. coli here, it's acceptable, but the growth is starting to get a little bit too thin. We are starting to see colonies between colonies. So if this was a clinical isolate, I would just read it and report it, but the aim is to have a confluent growth evenly spread over the plate. So if this happens often, probably you will have to adjust your streaking technique a little bit. The plate here with the Pseudomonas aeruginosa, here you can see a lot of patterns from how the plate was streaked, and that is also causing some problems, especially for this disc here in the bottom right part, where you get a flat line instead of a circular zone diameter, and that is only due to how the plate was streaked. And also, if you push your cotton swab too hard into the agar, that usually makes it more difficult to read zone diameters. For the Staph aureus here, this is what happens if you use a rotator, but you move your cotton swab too quickly over the agar surface. So again, no catastrophe, but the expected and best result is as the one to the left here. For the Haemophilus strain, we have not covered the whole area. There is some air up here that we haven't used, for example, and also the streaking pattern makes it more difficult to read the zone diameters. The general reading instruction is to read zone diameters at the point of complete inhibition, as judged by the naked eye and with the plate held about 30 centimeters from the eye. You can see some pictures here where we sometimes have a gradual decrease in growth, fuzzy zonages, or double zones, where you should normally read the inner zone unless otherwise stated, and you should normally take all growth into account, but not by looking very, very closely. You should hold the plate about 30 centimeters from the eye. It is also important to have the correct background and lighting. Standard Millihinton plates are read from the back of the plate against a dark background and illuminated with reflected light. And reflected light means that the light comes from above and is directed down to the plate. For the plates that contain blood, MHF and FAAHB, you have to remove the lid and read it, and it should also be illuminated with reflected light. We have a reading guide with many different examples on how to read zones. It contains both the general reading instructions and also some guidance on what should you do when you have fuzzy zonages. Not looking too close, not using a magnifying glass, for example, but it also contains examples with what to do when you have colonies within the zone, swarming, etc. We also know that it might be difficult to differentiate between growth and hemolysis for hemolytic organisms. And there we recommend that you tilt the plate back and forth to see if there is growth in the area where you have hemolysis. So if you follow the method, you use the correct disk potency, the correct medium, and the correct incubation temperature, you should get results that are reproducible. And in this case, it means that if you taste clinical isolates, you should have something that looks like a normal distribution like this. So here is an example of many E. coli isolates tested versus cefotaxime 5 microgram disc, and how they distribute. So we get a normal distribution like this with the highest bars in the middle and lower to the ends. And we will also, of course, need to know that we can separate between susceptible and resistant isolates. This is what it looks like when we have tested one strain. This is the Staph aureus QC strain, ATCC29213. It was tested 122 times. So this is from our laboratory. There are a number of different technicians involved. We have used Millihinton agar from 3 manufacturers, but apart from that, we used the same disk manufacturers, the same incubators, and tested the same strain over and over again. And the antibiotic tested here is cefoxitin, the screening disk for methicillin resistance in staphylococci. But very similar to what we just saw for what happens when we test different clinical isolates, you can see that also when we test the QC strain repeatedly, we will also get a normal distribution. So here we also have the highest bars in the middle, and then they get lower. So it's not perfect, but more or less it fits nicely with this blue curve. And in the next picture, I have kept the blue curve in the same position as when we tested the QC strain over and over again. But now the picture shows data from published studies. So none of these data is from our laboratory. It's from 11 different laboratories. And these are the isolates that were MEC-A negative, the ones that we would expect forming this normal distribution for Staph aureus and cefoxitin. What you can see is that this distribution is it's lower and wider, which is expected since we have many different isolates, different laboratories, different Millihinton agar manufacturers, and different disk manufacturers. But it's actually very similar to our distribution for the QC strain, and it is still in the same place. It distributes over the same zone diameters. In the same studies, we could separate out the MEK-A positive isolates. And as you can see, those are nicely separated from the wild type. So we do have a resistant population here, and then a wild type population up here where we don't have any resistance mechanisms. So this was an example on how we look at the disk diffusion data, and also an example of how disk diffusion works really well when you follow the methodology. So I said in the beginning that disk diffusion and zone diameter breakpoints must be calibrated to MIC and MIC breakpoints. The EUCAST zone diameter breakpoints are calibrated to EUCAST clinical MIC breakpoints. And we do that by performing parallel disk diffusion and broth microdilution for clinical isolates. And then we have to select both isolates representing wild type, those without phenotypic resistance, and also isolates with elevated MICs. And we look at, for each of these data points, the correlation between the inhibition zones and the broth microdilution MICs. In some cases, we would look at as also a correlation to a specific resistance mechanism, but normally it is the clinical MIC breakpoints that is our reference. So based on this data set, we establish zone diameters corresponding to the clinical MIC breakpoints. And we have a few principles. One is that the zone diameter breakpoints are set to minimize false susceptibility. We want the isolates that are tested as resistant with broth microdilution, that they also should be reported as resistant with disk diffusion. But we know that we sometimes do not have a perfect separation between the different populations. And we sometimes have areas with uncertain results where there is an overlap between susceptible and resistant isolates. And there we can establish an area of technical uncertainty, an ATU. So the MICs that we correlate to are produced with a reference antimicrobial susceptibility testing, broth microdilution, which is the international reference method for antimicrobial susceptibility testing and described in an ISO standard. And just as we talked at the beginning of this presentation that we have standardized the different parameters of disk diffusion, the same goes, of course, for broth microdilution, where we standardize more or less the same parameters. And we also have to perform broth microdilution in a standardized way to really trust our results. So MIC determination, according to the ISO standard with broth microdilution, is our gold standard for all other AST methods. So all other AST methods, including the disk diffusion method, has to be calibrated to reference broth microdilution. The MIC value is defined in the ISO standard like this. The lowest concentration that under defined in vitro conditions prevents visible growth of bacteria within a defined period of time. So you can see in that definition that it's very clear that it's standardized, it's defined in vitro conditions, and a defined period of time. Here's an example of a broth microdilution plate where you can test one isolate against a number of different antimicrobial agents. You always need a positive control, a well without antibiotics, to make sure that your bacteria is growing in the broth. And then here we have one new antimicrobial agent on each row, and we would read the MIC where we have no visible growth. Here you can see our setup at the EDL, where we have a camera unit connected to a software, but we would read the MICs manually. And we use an inverted mirror like this, which is useful because then you can see the growth from the bottom of the plate where you actually have the precipitated growth. So just very shortly, this is the recommended method for broth microdilution. We don't have a specific EUCAST document for this. We say that you should perform broth microdilution according to the ISO standard, but the ISO standard does not cover fastidious organisms. So in the EUCAST documents, you will find the recommendation for fastidious organisms, which is to use MHF broth, cation adjusted millihinton broth with 5% lysed horse blood and 20 milligrams per liter beta NAD. And as you can see, very similar to disk diffusion, the MIC should be read as the lowest concentration that completely inhibits growth as detected by the unaided eye. So if we look at some examples, here we have a zone diameter distribution for Staph aureus and levofloxacin. So you can see how the different zone diameters distribute. The colors of the bars correspond to different MIC values. So we have here in this example, for Staph aureus and levofloxacin, we don't have a susceptible standard dosing regimen category. So susceptible is green, the I category here is yellow, and resistant is red and orange. So you can see here that wild type Staph aureus versus levofloxacin, the ones without phenotypic resistance, they should be categorized as susceptible increased exposure in the I category. You can also see here that we have isolates with MICs of 1 milligrams per liter, of 2 milligrams per liter. They are close to the breakpoint, but we still have a very nice separation between the two populations, and it's not so difficult to set a zone diameter breakpoint here. Back to Staph aureus and cefoxitin. Here again, we have tested both isolates that are wild type, those with resistance mechanisms. We don't have a clinical breakpoint for cefoxitin, but we have a screening breakpoint. So isolates with MICs of 4 and below should be screen negative and be above the screen zone diameter screening breakpoint. What you can wonder when you see this picture is why is the breakpoint here at, 22, and there is a gap in between. The reason for that is that we normally have more data from more sources, and when we put more data together, we can see that the wild type is distributing all the way down to 22 millimeters. In this case, we also wanted to look at the presence of MEC-A. And as you can see here, black bars are for isolates that are MEC-A negative, and the red bars are for isolates that are MEC-A positive. So again, our disk diffusion test can reliably separate out the MEC-A positive isolates. Here we have an example where it's more difficult. E. coli and piperacillin tazobactam. And the darker the green, the lower the MICs. And we can see that we have a good correlation. With lower MICs, we have larger zone diameters. And when MICs increase, the zone diameters decrease. So we do have a good correlation, but we do not have a good separation because the susceptible and resistant populations overlap. We decided to put the breakpoint here more than or equal to 20 and have only very few false susceptible results here. We wanted the ones at 19 to be reported resistant, but as you can see, there are still quite many results that are susceptible here at 19. So that is also the ATU, the area of technical uncertainty, where it might be, if possible, relevant to perform broth microdilution. This is also another data set where we can see that we normally don't have that high numbers of isolates close to the breakpoint. This is a very challenged collection where we have added, intentionally added many isolates with MICs close to the breakpoint. And another example where we have another beta-lactamase inhibitor combination, ceftazidime avibactam, where we have a very nice separation here, or we don't have a gap between the distributions, but we can still separate very nicely between susceptible and resistant. For this combination, we have the wild type isolates up here with larger zones, then we have a resistant population. but with an MIC breakpoint of less than or equal to 8 as susceptible, that fits very well with the distribution, and therefore we don't get this overlap, and we don't need to have an ATU. So I will end this presentation by showing you where to find the documents and information you need to perform disk diffusion according to EUCAST. If you go to the EUCAST website and then AST of bacteria, then you can go to disk diffusion methodology. Here we have the manual, a Word or a text document that describes everything. There is a slide show that actually explains the method in a PowerPoint presentation, and that can be used if you want to educate staff at your laboratories, for example. And then we have the disk diffusion reading guide as a separate document. And we have two separate documents for the anaerobic bacteria, one that describes the method and one reading guide. We also have a number of instruction videos, very short, very detailed instruction videos that show you exactly how to do the different parts, how to prepare the inoculum, how to inoculate plates, and how to read zone diameters. You will find them here under videos and online seminars. And you can also go directly to YouTube, search for EUCAST Disk Diffusion, and you will find these. They are all with English speaker, but there are subtitles in a number of different languages. So there are also links to all these from the EUCAST website. So I usually end my presentations with this picture of me and my colleague Jenny. We have worked together a long time in the EDL and still do. You can see that this was a couple of years ago, but I like it because we enjoyed working with AST at that time, and we still do. And you are always welcome to contact us if you have questions related to the EUCAST methods, and we will do our best to help you with those.
Thank you very much, Dr. Erika. We really appreciate the time you took to prepare, and we're glad that you have shared a lot of information with us that is really eye-opening. During your presentation, that was very fantastic. You went back to the basic and taught us a lot, and that includes us knowing exactly the different factors that are affecting disk diffusion, because at the end of the day, that is what is important. You highlighted the depth, and you will see there are questions coming about the size as well, the incubation size, the incubation time, which is very important, also the temperatures that are relevant and the environmental conditions. You guided us in the preparation of the inoculum using then McFarlane standards and showed us how then the organism must be spread with limitation in the discs. There's a question coming on how many then discs can we then be looking at in different organisms, and I'll get to that question later. We've learned and gone back to caliper using, but at the same time, the distance between my eye and where my reading also came through. And we are glad to learn about the guidelines that came through from antibiotic for anaerobics and the 15-15-15 rule. That then also is important, because I can remember some of us many days ago, we would just prepare, then leave the discs there at room temperature until later in the afternoon to take then the box or the place to the incubator, not knowing that it affected the final results. I'm glad that EUCAST also looked at the gaps in the ISO standards and concentrated and decided on closing the gaps. We have some questions and comments as well that came through, and Sylvester, thank you very much. He has been working at the background, also trying to address some of them. But Peter Gumbo said, excellent presentation. Peter likes the pictorial presentation of the EGA. That's a comment that came from there. And Veronica Biela asked the question about sharing the presentation that Sylvester responded to. And also Joseph had the same. It shows that people are interested in seeing this more and taking this further to some colleagues that are not even here as well. But just as a reminder, the presentation is available. If you have registered on the system, you will then get an email after this, after everything has been packaged together with the video that you can then later use. We have several questions, and I'll start with the first one from Jinkal in India. Jinkal indicated that he or she is currently pursuing PhD in India, working on AMR from the different environmental samples. And the question is, can you please indicate the recommended depth of the media so as to get optimal, accurate results?
Do you mean the agar depth?
Yes.
Yes. That should be 4 millimeters, and our recommendation is 4 millimeter plus minus 0.5. And the reason that we have that range is that we know that you might not always end up exactly at 4 millimeters, but you should aim at being close to 4 millimeters and only having a random variation between 3.5 and 4.5. If you use a 90 millimeter circular Petri dish, then that corresponds to 25 or 26 milliliters of agar put into that plate, each individual Petri dish, to get an agar depth of 4 millimeters. But if you have another size, then you have to calculate with the volume to make sure that you get the correct depth. It's also possible to measure the agar depth. If you have a caliper, then you could use the end of the caliper, put it down into the agar, and then when it touches the agar, you will get an approximate agar depth measure there.
Okay, all right, that's also helpful. And I'm glad to Tafeze Koran who answered the question, and it also, the response was also based on media, but I will gladly hear the other responses from you. The question was from Fabrice, who asked, what are the limitations of the disk diffusion method, and what are the possible factors that may affect this method, leading to the wrong result or zone of inhibition? As I said, the Tafese started by responding, saying the inoculum concentration and thickness of the media may be the limited factor, generally human factor. Can I hear from you? What's your comment on that one, and further reasons as well?
Yes, one limitation of the disk diffusion method is that you cannot use it for every single agent that we want to test. So for example, testing vancomycin for staphylococci, that does not work well with disk diffusion. And the reason for that is that vancomycin is a very big molecule and it does not diffuse well in agar, and therefore it doesn't work. But in those cases, we do not have a recommendation from EUCAST that goes for daptomycin, for example, also where no one has been able to develop a reliable disk diffusion method. But of course, it's also important to use media and to use disks of good quality. We don't recommend a specific media manufacturer or disk manufacturer, but we say that you have to buy materials, use materials for which you will get expected results for the QC strains. So you have to check with the quality control strains, test them and measure the zone diameters and make sure that you are within the published ranges. And it's also optimal to be close to the target, which is the middle of the range and not always in the upper or lower part. So buying or using materials of good quality is, of course, also very important. And to perform quality control, we haven't talked about that today. That could be its own lecture, actually. But performing quality control, making sure that materials and equipment are working as they should, and also, of course, to evaluate the QC results. There is one of those instruction videos on quality control, how to perform it, and also how you can evaluate the data.
Thank you very much, Dr. Erika, for the response, and I'm glad that you are volunteering coming back to us and discussing quality control.
Yes, I can do that.
Yeah, Sylvester will discuss with Dr. Erika about the date early next year, just to be able then to cover that as well. And then, Beatrice, your hand is noted. I'm not going to be able to take questions directly from you. If you could kindly share, type it on the chat, we will then be able to cover it. We'll try and cover as many questions as possible today. If not, we will still be able to cover some questions later, even if it's a comment. I apologize, I'm not going to be able to take that. We have a lot to go through now. There's a question, Dr. Erika, from Hina, who says, how many I'll ask two questions just in the interest of time. Who says, how many minimum disks can we place at once to avoid overlapping? That's from Hina, and Eduardo saying, please go back to normal distribution. So I think you remember the slide on normal distribution. You don't have to project it, even if you can just run. Otherwise, you can just see how to address that question as well. The first one is on the minimum number of disks that can be placed.
So again, we normally use 90mm circular disks on a 90mm circular EGA plate. The maximum number of disks is 6, and usually if you buy a dispenser from a manufacturer that produces antimicrobial disks, they usually also have a dispenser that you can use with the disks. Those might have 8 or 6 positions, but it's very rare that you could have more than 6 disks on a plate. So 6 is the maximum, but then it will depend on which agents that you test and which organisms. So for example, we have for one of our Enterobacterales urine dispensers, we have 6 disks because we have many disks that give small zone diameters. It could be ampicillin, piperacillin, tazobactam, tobramycin. So if you have disks that will give you small zone diameters, then you can have more disks on the same plate. For Haemophilus influenzae, we would use 3 or 4 disks. Staph aureus could be 4 or 5. So we have tried to just test the system, and it could also be a matter of how you place the disks. If some are bigger or some zones are smaller, you can place them every second disk is smaller, every second disk is larger. So that is also something you can do to avoid overlapping of zone diameters.
Okay, thank you very much. Can I just do a follow-up question on that one? Are there different dispensers that have different numbers of disks that can be dispensed? You mentioned that for the Haemophilus, they're going to be different without showing the number of days that I haven't been in a lab.
At least the system that we use, we can buy with 6 places or 8 places. So if we put only 4 disks on a plate, we would choose the one with 8 places because then they are better distributed over the plate. But normally, I would say that 6 is the most common number, and that is also our maximum recommended number of disks.
All right, I'm glad that you clarified the 4 because I don't remember seeing a 4 dispenser, but we'll work it from the 8. Then Christian says, please, how to take account pure colonies with a clear zone around the disk? I'm not sure if you understand the question, but let me repeat it.
Yeah, I think it relates to if you have performed your disk diffusion and you're reading your zones, and then you have colonies within your zone, in your inhibition zone. So if that was the question, the answer is that you should first check if you have a pure culture or could it be a contamination growing within the zone. So if you're testing an E. coli and a Staph aureus is growing in the, or Staph epidermidis maybe more likely is growing within the zone, then you could ignore it. But normally we know that, and specifically for some species agent combinations, that colonies appear within the zones, and you should take them into account and read the colony-free inner zone. There are a few exceptions. We have an exception for phosphomycin disk diffusion testing for E. coli, for methicillin and temocillin. For those, you should ignore if you have isolated colonies, and that is listed specifically in the EUCAST documents and in the reading guide. But normally, say you test an Enterobacter cloacae for cefotaxime and you have colonies within the zones, then you take them into account and read the colony-free inner zone.
Okay. All right. Thank you. I hope that was clear, and then it provided with the necessary guidelines. There's a question from Fabrice. I'm going to, if you allow me not to take most of your questions, I'll come back to them if there are time, just to allow the other colleagues then to come through. But I'm glad that you are posing the questions. We will still be able to answer them even if it's not today. Tologelo says, how do you interpret the AST profiles of an antibiotic not listed in the EUCAST and CLSI guidelines. Prof. Guna addressed this partly last week about those that are not there, but I'm glad that you are here. Please respond to that one, Dr. Erika.
Yes. So if there are no breakpoints in the EUCAST breakpoint tables, you cannot report S, I, or R. But sometimes you maybe have to perform, or there is a need to perform the test anyway. And if there are no zone diameter breakpoints, you should never perform disk diffusion, then you have to perform an MIC. And if you have that MIC, you can go to the EUCAST MIC database, which I'm sure that Gunnar showed you, where you can see the distributions, and there is an ECOF, which is the value that will separate or tell you which isolates are wild type, those without phenotypic resistance, and those that are not wild type, those that have phenotypic resistance. So if you're lucky, there is a distribution in the database, and you can use that and say that this isolate probably does not have resistance mechanisms, or this isolate probably has resistance mechanisms. There is also a specific document from EUCAST, which is called What to Do When There Are No Breakpoints, where it actually takes you through those steps. And there is also a table there where you have some cutoff values where you can report resistant if your MIC is above that cutoff. But it is for the same antibiotics that are in the EUCAST table. So it's more for organisms for which we don't have breakpoints. So if you test another antibiotic that is not in EUCAST tables, then it's much more difficult to interpret. It could still be in the EUCAST database. Otherwise, I think you have to search in the literature to try to find out how to interpret that. So that is a difficult question. But if you have specific questions, you can send them to us, and we will do our best to help you and give you some answer back.
Okay, thank you very much. The questions are coming and many. Jinkal, if you also then allow us not to take all of your questions in the interest of allowing other colleagues to come and ask the questions. And as I indicated, that we will ensure that some of the questions that have not come up now, or we haven't had time, we will then share them with Dr. Erika and then respond again later, so that you are then able to get to the questions, because the idea is for us to allow as many people as possible to be able to ask then the questions during this platform. We have, I think, other colleagues that are coming back again with and thinking the questions on the breakpoints and thickness. I think we have exhausted them. There's Rao who then says, can you please detail about the resistant breakpoints for ceftriaxone for Neisseria gonorrhea?
For Neisseria gonorrhea, currently EUCAST do not have a disk diffusion method, but we are working on that. So we now have good data where we have reproducible results for disk diffusion of Neisseria gonorrhea, and we are now waiting for reference MICs, which for Neisseria will be from agar dilution and not broth microdilution. So we will soon have data where we can correlate zone diameters to MICs for Neisseria gonorrhea. And in that process, we will also review the breakpoints, the MIC breakpoints for Neisseria. So we will look into the ceftriaxone breakpoint and all the other breakpoints. We know that there are ceftriaxone resistant Neisseria gonorrhea found. They are still quite few, but they are found, and they are usually resistant to also other classes of antimicrobial agents. So we think that it's very important to have a good method to detect ceftriaxone resistance in Neisseria gonorrhea.
Okay, I think time is no longer on our side, but I would love to please take the question from Afi. I then delayed going through it, trying to translate it. It's written in French, but it says that, thank you for the training. I would like to understand something for 60mm boxes. Is it no longer advisable to deposit 6 discs?
So is this question also on the number of discs? If you have another size of the plate?
Yes, I think so.
Yes. I don't know the exact maximum number for each of the different plate formats. So I would say that our recommendation is that you will have to test, and you can use the QC strains for that. How should you place your disks to use the agar surface in an optimal way by placing smaller and larger disks next to each other? And then you could, based on that, you have to set up your recommendations for your own laboratory. But our recommendation is to avoid overlapping of zone diameters, and as much as possible have whole zone diameters to read, if that is possible.
Okay, thank you very much. Due to time constraints, unfortunately, we do have questions. Some of them are for people that have already asked the questions that we are unable then to take now. Together with Sylvester, we'll ensure that you get them, and then we are able to respond and share the responses with the colleagues later. Thank you very much, Dr. Erika. I think you have taken us back to basics. However, it's important that we do able to come and be able to address, and we will definitely come back to you about the date early next year for us to discuss quality controls, and we will invite everybody that's here to also come back and take the opportunity to do that. I would also like to highlight the code for you to download the certificate that is now displayed. Thanks, Fitzam, for that. So that if you have then registered, you would then be able to get the updates and the codes as you need, with access from our resource services via the ASLM Academy portal. It is a wonderful session, really, and will ensure that we'll be bringing you more of the sessions that will be interesting from you, from us as ASLM. We promise that we'll keep on continuing having topics that are interesting to address this very topic of AMR. And I want to say thanks not only to the sponsors, I want to say to Dr. Erika, thanks for taking the time for the preparation, for really your responsiveness early and as needed. It's really appreciated. To Julia, Sarah, thanks for the interpretation. To Sylvester, all the time, the work that you are doing. Fitzam, as always, thank you very much. You are a star. We are grateful, ladies and gentlemen, that you joined us, and we are happy that you are still with us. We are looking forward to joining us in the next session. Enjoy the rest of your day and the weekend ahead. Goodbye.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Goodbye from us.